Who is the father of water skiing? No Lake City school child would be stumped for the answer. After all, they line the sidewalks one June day every year, settling in with their parents and thousands of visitors for a 3-hour parade of marching bands, classic cars, antique tractors, marvelous steeds, and zippy, scooter-born Shriners. They assembled in tribute to the spotlight shone on the little town decades earlier by favorite son Ralph Samuelson. Everyone thought I was nuts, he acknowledged years later. Sports Illustrated labeled him a thrill-seeking river rat when he first experimented behind a powerboat driven by his older brother Ben. In the space of a few days, he would, by trial and error, invent the instruments to race, jump, and zigzag on water, eliciting from friends and skeptics gathered on shore the unanimous verdict, "You did it, Sammy." The date was June 28, 1922, 6 days before Samuelson would turn 19. A plaque installed at the government pier on South Lakeshore Drive notes that during the next 15 years, Samuelson put on one-man skiing exhibitions, donating most of the admission charges to Lake City for the purchase of harbor and parkland. Eager for greater pulling speed and more spectacle, Samuelson enlisted a barnstorming pilot in a World War I vintage Curtiss flying boat. On the first attempt, Samuelson was jerked right out of his skis and suffered a long, painful skid on his stomach. Not to be deterred, Samuelson and the pilot dropped advertising leaflets over Lake City and surrounding towns, promising a fresh performance the following weekend. The 2,000 spectators who turned out cheered a successful run with the plane registering an airspeed of 80 miles per hour. For decades, there were a number of claims and counterclaims as to the origins of water skiing and its inventor, but a timeline constructed in 1965 by a writer for the St. Paul Pioneer Press led the American Water Ski Association to confirm the verdict of those who were eyewitnesses on that June day in 1922. Sammy had done it. No name is so prominent and enduring in the support of Lake City institutions as the Patton family. Although no descendants of the original Patton pioneers are resident today, the name is attached to our most central public park across from the post office, to our library, and to scholarships for outstanding Lincoln High graduates. When George William Patton died in 1955 at the age of 78, his will provided $60,000 to the Lake City Hospital and $30,000 to the library. Other cash bequests went to the Women's Club, Lakewood Cemetery, the Congregational Church, Boy Scouts, and Campfire Girls. Total bequests of $145,000 translate into $1.2 million if given in today's dollars. George Williams' grandfather, also a George, brought the Patton name west from Ohio in 1855 when physicians suggested the change in climate could improve his failing health. After investigating the Wisconsin, Iowa, and Minnesota territories, he settled first in Winona, but soon judged Lake City's early stirrings and natural setting as more opportune. He had ready money. As a lad of 15, he had entered the mercantile business, an early version of the department store, and his managerial and money talents over 29 years left him with considerable affluence. Lake City life for the family began, humbly enough, in a cold, rain-soaked shanty upon arriving by steamship on the proverbial dark and stormy night. There was no boat landing, but the steamship captain granted the family a special accommodation to put their cow and household effects ashore. Patton lost no time in building a comfortable home in what is now Patton Park, and he opened a mercantile store at 224 South Washington, the present location of the American Legion. George William was pursuing a medical doctorate degree at the University of Minnesota when his father Hiram died. He dropped out to help manage the family enterprise. During his lifetime and afterwards, George Williams' generosity extended beyond Lake City to various projects benefiting young people on a national and international scale. In reporting his death in 1955, the Lake City Graphic noted, "He leaves his wife, Mary B., and a number of cousins, but many families and children of these families in Asia, Europe, and the USA have called him Uncle Will, for through him they have received the boost they needed to get on their feet. Sometimes it was a college education, and sometimes medical assistance or help with other physical needs." In an 1854 letter from Lake Pepin, Minnesota, Abner Dwelle wrote these words to his daughter Carrie and other of his grown children back in Michigan. There was a tone of exasperation because they had expressed some reluctance in joining their father on the frontier. "If you expect to get any of the land I have got a claim on, you must come this fall, for the land will be surveyed this winter, and all that is on their claims will hold the land. I have got 4 claims, one for myself, and one for you, and one for Merrill, and one for Henry, 160 acres each. Now after I have paid out all my money, and got you all as good a location as I have, and broke into a new country, deprived myself of the comforts of life, and then for you to think hard to break away from acquaintance, you are different from me. Relation or acquaintance won't support you without you work for it." The family eventually acquired 3/4 sections of land in what abstracts today would identify as part of the half-breed tract, an area originally reserved by treaty for offspring of unions between Native Americans and Europeans. 2 of Abner Dwelle's sons, Merrill, 26 when he volunteered, and Thomas, who was 21, fought in the Civil War, and both were wounded, Merrill at Antietam and Thomas at Ball's Bluff. While recovering from his wounds at Smoketown Hospital near the Antietam battlefield, Merrill wrote to his sister Carrie about a Confederate prisoner he came to know. "He would go out and get me things to eat, and one day when we were eating together, I laughingly said to him, 2 days ago we were shooting at each other, and now we are eating out of the same dish. But that is according to Scripture. The lion and the lamb shall lie down together." He was a good fellow, and I should not fear to fall into his hands if I should ever be taken prisoner. Returning to civilian life, Thomas farmed his land a mile or so from downtown Lake City, increasing his operation to some 200 acres. Merrill was not relieved of his uniform so quickly. Assigned to the 3rd Battery, Minnesota Light Infantry, he was sent westward to defeat Indians who were reacting violently to starvation and broken treaties. Treaties would be required of the rest. Operating across the Missouri, over the Dakota prairies, and into the Badlands, Merrill and his men were to range over 3,000 miles in 3 years. In his description, they, quote, "marched through the heat of the summer with the mercury up to 100 degrees, faced the deadly blizzard of winter with the temperature down to 40 below, and scraped snow from the frozen earth to make their beds." Dwelle wrote that having accomplished their mission and having avoided the fate of General Custer, the men were entitled to, quote, "at least the gratitude of the nation for their services." Back in Lake City, Merrill clerked in hardware, lumber, and general stores, served as alderman, and then partnered with his brother Henry in a clothing store. At age 70, he and his son Glenn lived up to their pioneering name, this time in the establishment of a telephone business. From rudimentary beginnings in 1905, manual switchboards gave way in the 1950s to automatic switches, then computers. Then came the inevitable absorption by nationally known enterprises. But the original building is still the headquarters for local service. The Dwelle name appears on our street signs, and the family is the only one of those who pioneered the city to be represented by descendants living here today. The original settler, Abner, was one of 3 who had joined in planting the town in 1857. He also was remembered as having gone from being a deacon in the Congregational Church to embracing the spiritualistic faith. Politically, he was an abolitionist, a Whig, and in later years, a Republican. In the century and a half since the first pioneers arrived to start their lives anew in Lake City, making history, recording it, and bringing it forward into the present have absorbed many good people. In our own time, the names of those who are messengers for the past are familiar to us from newspaper articles, history books, and storytelling. Virginia Holst, Shirley Ludinger, Eloise Blattner, Katie Schmidt, Ethel Moyer, to name just a few. But to a person they would acknowledge in admiration and for inspiration, the late Alice Grannis Murdoch. Alice Grannis was born here in 1894. Her parents on both sides had come to the area prior to Minnesota's becoming a state in 1858. Her grandfather Grannis was involved with the lumber mill and sorghum mill on Central Point property that in later years held the Shanty Bar, then the Nyhart Resort, and today the Willows Condos and Skyline Restaurant. Alice's father, Arthur Grannis, was described by the Lake City Graphic Republican as a pioneer merchant in a front-page article reporting his death in 1936. His paper and paint store, established in the early 1900s, was on downtown Center Street, where Ackerman Total Eye Care is located today. Highly educated, with both a bachelor's and master's from the University of Minnesota, Alice spoke with a local news reporter in 1957 about why she did not complete her doctoral studies.
I almost had my doctorate finished when World War II came along. Wartime, with all of the violence it entailed, royal emotions and attitudes, and I felt it was useless to continue the research I needed for my doctorate.
The abandoned paper was titled Developing Attitudes of Tolerance in High School Students. Alice Murdoch taught history for 30 years, 19 of them at the college level in Winona and Duluth, but left teaching in 1943 upon her marriage to John Murdoch, a lawyer from Wabasha. In 1957, the 100th anniversary of the platting of Lake City, she wrote a series of articles for the Graphic on local history, with frequent reference to the Native Americans, whose culture and livelihoods had been so profoundly affected by European traders and settlers. Years earlier, she had gone to the National Archives in Washington, D.C. to see the original documents relating to an area that included all of Lake City and much more that was reserved by treaty for the offspring of Native Americans and Europeans. She began one of her 1957 graphic articles with these words:
Wabasha County's early historical heritage, the very name itself, is wrapped up in the lives and activities of 7 bands who roamed this territory under the leadership of hereditary chiefs, the 3 Wabashas.
Recalling what she had learned from her grandfather Grannis and her own later research, Alice Murdoch went on to explain how the fortunes of the Indians became entwined, for good or ill, with the Europeans, beginning with French fur traders.
Wabasha's people were soon engaged in a very profitable trade with the French. Some of the Indian women became wives of the French traders. It is no wonder then that Wabasha's warriors fought with the French against the British in the struggle for the great trading areas, a struggle that Britain won in 1763, forcing the French to leave.
Having cast their lot with the losing side, the Indians were forced to make hard choices just to survive. They had become dependent on the French for tools, ammunition, and other supplies, and making stone tools and weapons had become a lost art.
Wabasha called a council at which it was decided to seek aid from the English. The chief and several of his men headed for British headquarters in Quebec, taking with them a captive who had killed an Englishman, hoping to gain favor with their former adversaries. The captive escaped, and when the chief and the 5 of his men reached the British governor's station, Waukesha offered himself for execution in place of the escaped murderer. He implored the governor to send provisions and ammunition to his people in exchange for furs. Impressed by Waukesha's unselfishness, the governor responded with generous supplies, promised future help, and presented the chief with 7 silver medals, 1 for each of the 7 Sioux bands. Over the next decade, the chief would be received warmly in Quebec, where he was addressed as general. Waukesha repaid the trust of his benefactors by siding with the British in the Revolutionary War, a demonstration of loyalty that again found the local Sioux on the losing end.
Alice Grannis Murdoch, whose accomplishments are documented in Minnesota's Who's Who, died December 8, 1988, at the age of 94. While her pioneer forebears struggled with personal anxieties and an uncertain future, they also laid the groundwork for the common good: schools, governing structure, churches. The Grannis family was entwined at the beginning with Lake City's first church, the Congregational. The present church is the second to be built on the plot acquired from grandfather George W. Grannis and his wife Lucetta in 1890. And the church parking lot on Lyon Avenue was the site of the home of Alice Murdoch's parents, a property she turned over to the church prior to her death. Lumber from the Grannis Mill created the city's first school.
Nell Mabey came from pioneer stock that originated in New England. Her grandparents settled in Florence Township, Minnesota in 1858. Upon their marriage in 1877, her parents, Joseph and Lucinda Mabey, resided in Lake City. The family home was on the southwest corner of Marion and South Prairie Streets. Joseph and Lucinda supported their 8 children as proprietors of a meat market at 117 South Lakeshore Drive, a business that continues today at another location under Huddle family ownership. Nell was born on September 2, 1874, and passed in 1959 at the age of 85. She retired in the early 1930s after 25 years at the Minneapolis Tribune, where she edited the back page, woman's page, and church page, and wrote advice columns for mothers and the lovelorn.
As to the columns, one does not need to be married to know about the hills and valleys of a love affair. And coming from a family of 8 siblings, mothering was experienced daily. Sometimes yet I wake up in the night thinking that I have forgotten to read proof on one of my pages.
Upon her retirement, Nell resided with her widowed sister Lulu at Bramble Hall Estate in Frontenac. Lulu's late husband was Colonel James N. Monroe, U.S. Cavalry, a West Point graduate, an ardent conservationist. Now that she was retired, Nell began a second career as a poet. Many of her works were published in national magazines, and she was one of Minnesota's better-known poets.
I did most of my composing out of doors. One time I was working at a tree when a deer passed right by me. Sometimes we sat at our breakfast table by the window. There would be as many as 5 deer.
Nell had 2 books published, Clover Blossoms in 1938 and Wimpy of Bramble Hall in 1955. Her last work reflects the beauty she found in Frontenac and Bramble Hall.
Bramble Hall lives forever. Seen as in a glass and not darkly, but in dancing, prismatic light.
Wimpy was Nell's Irish Water Spaniel, a breed known as the Clown of the Spaniels, and thus a perfect vehicle for capturing the rhythms of life at the Monroe estate. In her poem, Quiet Time at Bramble Hall, we find these lines.
The owl that called his folksy "hoo" is silent now it's afternoon. The mourning dove is silent too. Upon our doorstep shadows swoon, and all about the grounds are strewn. The wimpy sleeps upon his paw. It's quiet time at Bramble Hall.
Bramble Hall, which means prickly hawthorn bush, was built in 1925. A stone wall and gate marked the entrance south of Frontenac Station on Highway 61. The road inward once led to the beautiful two-story New England-style home of Colonel James Monroe and Lulu. It was the Monroes' intention to preserve Bramble Hall by eventually establishing a state park that would embrace the home and its surrounding 160 acres. Both passed away before that could be accomplished. Upon her sister's death, Nell moved to Lake City to live with her sister Alice and brother-in-law Elton Lamb. Their Victorian cottage at 315 North Prairie made way over time to the education annex of the First Lutheran Church, a structure now occupied by Lake City family physicians. In Lake City, Nell joined the Women's Club, the third oldest in the state, having been established in 1894. Under its umbrella, she pushed for Bramble Hall's establishment as the nucleus of a new state park, activism that was noted by the club when it made her an honorary member. Gradually, through letters to park commissioners and legislators, and efforts of the Frontenac State Park Association she founded, opposition from Frontenac residents gave way.
In the beginning, it was a park. My sister always thought of it as such.
The park was finally established in 1957, and the house was used for a time as the park manager's residence and offices. 200 acres were joined to Bramble Hall's 160 in a donation from John H. Housechild. Camping and picnic facilities were constructed. Classification as a natural state park means that the land will be preserved for its ecological values rather than primarily for recreation. While part of the Monroes' dreams for their estate was triumphal and a legacy for generations to come, a note of sadness lingers. The home itself was razed in the 1990s, and the once elegant and photogenic approach to Bramble Hall is no longer maintained by the Park Service.
Old Frontenac, a painting done in tender notes of mauve and dove pastels of petal shades. All about the little town are flower pots at ease. At Frontenac, bewitched with joy.
Upwards of 50 diaries, each about 3 by 5 inches in size, repose as chronicles of our past in the archives of the Lake City Historical Society. Their author, Oliver P. Francisco, a fiddle-playing troubadour and sugarloaf valley farmer, began writing in 1856 and made his last entry on January 16, 1926, the day before his death. The tiny volumes transport the reader back to the time when plows drawn by oxen penetrated prairie sod for the first time, young Minnesota men were sent off to fight in the Civil War, and music makers provided respite from the perils and hard labor of settler life. At age 10, Francisco had already mastered the violin, and he organized a local four-piece orchestra soon after he arrived in Red Wing from New York State in 1856. He was 27. Music was a paying proposition, $10 an evening for the orchestra, 35 cents for a lesson, as Francisco would record in his diary. According to a newspaper account, Francisco and his orchestras played in venues throughout southern Minnesota and western Wisconsin, including St. Paul, Stillwater, Hastings, Red Wing, Lake City, Wabasha, Mazeppa, Ellsworth, River Falls, Mantorville, and Pine Island. Just reaching the more distant of these communities from his Sugarloaf farm home was a test of pluck and endurance, especially in harsh winter. The horseless carriage was decades away. Thumbing through these diaries, we learn of many of the writer's first-time experiences. Breaking sod in 1860, a low temperature of 34 below zero in 1861, still lower, 56 degrees below in 1888. He first heard a phonograph in 1912, took his first airplane ride in 1920, and heard his first radio broadcast in 1924. At 96, pronounced fit to travel by his physician, Mr. Francisco and two of his daughters made a trip to a radio station in St. Paul, where his fiddle playing reached the largest audience of his long career. Diary entries recount the departure of local volunteers to fight in the Civil War in 1862, celebrate the victory of the Union soldiers in the 1863 Battle of Vicksburg, and mourn the assassination of President Lincoln in 1865. In 1864, Francisco records a visit to the family home by Colonel William Colville. Colville, the first to enlist in the war from Goodhue County, was renowned for his courage in leading the 1st Minnesota Volunteers in a desperate charge at Gettysburg. 80% of his men perished, and Colville, twice hit by musket balls, refused a doctor's recommendation to amputate his ankle. He carried the ill effects of his serious wounds throughout the rest of his life. Despite a heavy schedule of musical appearances, Francisco was a dedicated farmer. As new machinery became available, he adopted it for reaping and binding. He developed a commercial orchard from 200 apple trees purchased at Jewell Nursery in Lake City, collected syrup from trees across the river in Wisconsin, and dug a water well that he lined with stone cut from nearby bluffs. Francisco describes popular recreational activities of the day: square dances, horse racing, quilting bees, sheet and pillowcase parties. In 1890, Francisco records the tragic capsizing in Lake Pepin of the Sea Wing, which took the lives of 98 men, women, and children from the local area. He remarks on the ceremony dedicating the Villa Maria in Frontenac in 1891 and writes that 10,000 people attended the 1895 opening of the Red Wing Wagon Bridge over the Mississippi. Francisco died in 1926 at the age of 96. He was undoubtedly the oldest violinist in the state. He was a member of the Odd Fellows Lodge for 73 years, a membership record. Francisco founded the Lake Pepin Valley Old Settlers Association, which survives today as the Lake City Historical Society.